Okay, so I went to edit the footage from last session and I lost the file. It cut out completely. I went back to the source file and it was corrupted. I have some of the visuals from the original clip slash session. Some of it is still there, but most of it is messed up and it's completely unusable. So sorry for the delay on that, but it's wiped. I can't really do anything about it. But with that being said, I wanted to still have something for you guys, and I wanted to have something recorded that we can look at and can still be useful. So if you didn't show up, there's still valid information from last session. And on top of that, I can just like clean up some visuals, maybe give more information, maybe go a bit more in depth. We'll see. But that's the scenario. Original video got wiped. Got to start over. Sorry for the inconvenience. So first things first, these sessions are iterative, so they build off of each other. So the first session was gesture, and then we did some basic form studies, so on and so forth, and now we're at silhouettes. With silhouettes, I want to incorporate some of the stuff we did previously, so we have a method on how to handle them, and then once we have a baseline silhouette, how do we apply more fundamentals that we've gone over in previous sessions to flesh it out and take it in different directions. Essentially, we're going to be using gesture to build the silhouette, and then we're going to be using stuff like form to carve out some more shapes and think about ways to push it further. With that out of the way, the first thing I want to touch on is the setup and addressing how we set up the silhouette. And the first thing that I'm going to do here is start with a basic gesture. And same as before, very basic shape, using basic measurements and little lines to give myself an area to work within, and just making basic shapes and lines like circles, your CSL or CSI lines to build up something that looks vaguely human. Since a lot of the larger shapes and forms are going to be doing a lot of the heavy lifting, what's nice about going from this to a silhouette is we can be a bit more loose, because all of what we're doing at this stage is going to be acting as a guide for those larger shapes later. When I make silhouettes on my own, I tend to just use a larger brush and skip this step, but again, I wanted to show how those earlier gesture drawings can be used to build up a silhouette if you're not comfortable making an entire form with just one texture or one like large block of information. So if you need to subdivide that, you can use gesture. But I generally skip this step, and I usually just work as large as I can, carving in those shapes to build up the form. One thing that I like to do on top of having a large brush and just going straight into it is I also try to make sure that my brush has opacity and flow. I want there to be some information left behind when I go into rendering or concepting later on. And you'll see the benefits and effects of this later on once we go over some different methods once we have a basic silhouette. But if you see a lot of information getting left behind, if you're wondering why I use the brushes that I use, it's so that I can have that preliminary information saved up for later. So now that I have some silhouettes, what are we supposed to do with them? Generally speaking, when we create silhouettes, they're there for something else. And a lot of this is going to come down to character design, trying to push other elements like armor, body shape, positive and negative space, other creative elements, trying to build up something that we can create a coherent character out of later. Or we're trying to be creative with it. You know, we're just practicing, we're trying to see how quickly we can construct a figure, and we want to skip all the annoying stuff because maybe we're trying to specifically practice rendering, maybe it's something in between. If we wanted to use this and turn it into a faster way to set up some sort of form study or some sort of rendering of the figure, we can go in that direction as well. So there's a lot of information to consider, but I'm essentially just going to split this up into two separate little mini tutorials, and then we'll go from there. So in this first approach, I'm essentially just blocking out the forms and starting in color. So I'm going to switch the silhouette from a 100% black monstrosity here to something that's skin tone based. I'm going to add a base gradient to it just to set up my dark and light environment just a little bit on the form. And then with a clipping mask, I'm going to grab my big brush and just start blocking in some basic forms with a shadow tone. I keep things pretty loose and messy in the beginning, but one thing I'll do is I'm actually going to go back and lock in some basic shapes. As mentioned earlier, I want to reincorporate some of the stuff that we were learning in those first few sessions, and one of those is form. So if we have our 100% like monotone color thing here, and we're starting to consider how do we pop out these forms, and how do we get some humanoid shapes in here, the way that we add that is just by making the basic shapes from our form studies into our character here. So if the head is a sphere, we just start rendering the head as a sphere. If the torso, upper torso, and lower torso, if those are just basic cubes, then we can just render them as basic cubes. And you can see these preliminary shapes that we're building are really good bases for adding more detail later. And that's really the main benefit of starting with a silhouette and then carving in basic shapes later, is we can see how we can use this to render more detailed parts of the body later. After a bit of practice, you'll come to realize that rendering is just carving out basic shapes in the body, and getting detail is nothing more than changing the particularities of the shape, so you're just subdividing that cube you made for the torso into smaller ones to capture the muscles. From there, outside of just breaking down smaller layers of detail, it's also just making sure that the shapes you capture match the light environment that they're in. You're gonna be pretty close to having a good foundation for more detailed rendering. Like if you can just nail the silhouette and you can nail putting basic shapes inside of it, and then you just have all those shapes work together, you're like 90% through understanding how to render the human body. So if you can do this, if you can learn this, keep your head up because you're off to a really good start. So now that I messed with this a bit, I want to touch on the second method, and we're going to jump onto that right now. So with this method, I'm going to be a little bit more focused on carving in shapes and getting things to be a little tighter, at least on the outside of our silhouette here. And this is where my brush from earlier is really going to be helpful. And I'm referring to my process here. When I say my brush, all I really mean is just as I'm creating the silhouette, leaving space for some opacity changes. That's the main thing I want to focus on in capture, not so much, you should be using this brush or this texture. That's not super important. The main thing is just leaving space for detail later. And I know if you're focused on creating a convincing figure, especially if you just made your base silhouette from reference, it can feel a little counterintuitive or non-academic to start messing around with the proportions that you have established already. But I think when it comes to trying to understand and learn the strengths of working with a silhouette, it's important to get comfortable manipulating the base structure that you have here, playing with the proportions, see where we can push things, because we want to create the groundwork for messing with the shapes as we go through this. So as mentioned, one benefit is the usage and indication of negative and positive space. That's finding those little gaps in the arms, contours in the hips, contours in the torso, and the arrangement of the limbs that are going to create those secondary shapes that exist within the figure, or even around the outside of it. We're really trying to appreciate the shapes that we're making here, and we're trying to see where we can incorporate them throughout the piece and create some sense of rhythm as we go through. And similar to paying attention to the forms that you're using, when it comes to negative space and carving in shapes that we want to be focusing on those primary basic shapes in order to establish that rhythm. So that would be your circles, your triangles, your cubes, anything like that that we can find within the contours or lineups of this piece. And then we sort of want to carve and move things around so that we can have that shape language continue throughout the entire silhouette. And what's nice is because we're in black and white, and because our base figure here is so low detail, it's really easy to find where these moments are happening, and it's even easier to continue them throughout the piece and just carve them in quickly. You can see as I go through this, I'm mainly focused on erasing and carving into the silhouette so that I can push some more triangular shapes. Looks like triangles and cones are the main things that I'm seeing, so the main thing I'm pushing are those shapes. So whenever I carve into the form, it's to try and grab more of that shape language. And even with some of the more decorative elements, I'm going to add like a little cape later on. Even with stuff like that, I'm still trying to keep them fairly triangular as I move them throughout the piece. That's it for the little demo. I just wanted to cover how we can set up the silhouette, which when it comes down to it, it's just gesture again. And then when we want to add more detail or think about character design, it's just focusing on form, shape language, and negative space. And if you want some videos that go more in depth on silhouettes and how you can use them, if you want to push character concepting or character design, or if you want to be more figurative, for lack of better words, and you want to find other ways that you can manipulate your silhouette and play with the form, I'll have some links to some other videos below this one in the Discord. So if you're in the server, you should see them. Should be like 1 or 2 other videos. Aside from that, thank you for the folks that have continued to participate each week. I hope to see more of you in the next session. Thank you for all the people who continue to return, so on and so forth. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.